This video briefly summarizes the known historical events of the Milky Way galaxy from the ancient history of the galaxy before the birth of humanity up through the 41st millennium in the Warhammer 40,000 setting. Throughout, comparative references to present dates will be made with respect to the original imperial calendar used before the birth of the Great Rift. This is the time period in which the perspectives of the Imperium of Man and the Eldari are particularly relevant, and it represents the present time. All dates are given in the format 9999.m41, which should be read as the year 40,999 AD in the ancient Gregorian calendar. Knowledge of the long ages of human history has been wreathed in shadow, buried beneath the aeons, or simply lost over the expanse of time. Some historians continue to seek knowledge, but their work can be compared to holding a candle against the dark abyss. The historians of the Adeptus Administratum seek, gather, and dutifully collect the history of each planet within the Imperium. Once, perhaps, this was done with purpose. Now, however, it is most often an indiscriminate compilation of data, a process where scribes unthinkingly copy content onto scrolls, preserving complete records in constant fear of missing a single inconsequential letter. The ability, or even desire, to translate what these facts mean in any larger sense is almost entirely absent, found only in a few individuals who are eyed suspiciously, or perhaps punished for their enthusiasm. The largest and most complete collection of such records exists beneath the surface of Terra, where the colossal underhalls stretch out of sight. Endless vistas of data scrolls tower upwards like mountains. With flickering candlelight, provided by floating servo skulls, processions of curators, scriveners, and ciphers wind through the valleys, attempting to illuminate that which was. Over the years, old truths have been lost to the adjustments and redactions made by revisionists of the Adeptus Ministorum, the Inquisition, and even the High Lords of Terra themselves. Pre-human history. Birth of the Star Gods. The birth of the entities later known as the Star Gods occurred at the same time as the moment of creation itself, as they formed from the vast, insensate energies first unleashed by that churning mass of cataclysmic force. In that anarchic interweaving of matter and energy, the sea of stars began to swirl into existence, and for an eon the universe was nothing more than hot hydrogen gas and light elemental dust ruled over by the gravitic force of billions of newborn suns. Long before the first planets had formed and cooled, the very first truly self-aware beings emerged into the universe, their thoughts encased within the lines of force produced by the plasma and electromagnetic flares of the stars themselves. In later times, these entities would become known as the Citan, but early in their existence they were nothing like the malevolent beings they would eventually become. They were little more than monstrous energy parasites that suckled upon the solar energies of the stars that had brought them into existence, shortening the lives of otherwise main sequence stars by millions of standard years. In time, these star vampires learned to move along the lines of the universe's electromagnetic flux, leaving their birthplaces to drift through the cosmic ether to new stellar feeding grounds and begin their cycle of stellar destruction once more. Beings of pure energy, they paid no mind to the hunks of solid matter they passed in the vacuum of space, the blazing geothermal fires and weak geomagnetic fields of these nascent planets, insufficient to be worth feeding even their ravenous hunger. Old ones, just as the stars gave birth to their children, so the planets of the newborn Milky Way galaxy eventually gave birth to life forms composed of matter, which began the long evolutionary climb to self-awareness. The first intelligent beings of the galaxy known to have developed a civilization technologically advanced enough to cross the stars was a reptilian species of beings later called the Old Ones by the Eldari, who knew them best of all their creations. The Old Ones possessed a slow, cold-blooded but still deep wisdom, having long studied the stars and raised astronomy and physics, to such a level that their science and technology appear now to humanity like an arcane art. Their understanding of the workings of the universe was such that they could manipulate alternate dimensions and undertake great works of psychic engineering. The Old Ones were potent psychers who routinely used the powers of the warp for a wide variety of technological applications. This included the construction of a system of instantaneous, faster-than-light portals through warp space. These portals connected all of the Old Ones' colony worlds allowing them to cross the vast gulfs of space with only a single step through the myriad warp gates they built to connect the worlds of the galaxy. This was a vast interdimensional network, much like the webway of today, which is its direct descendant, though on a much larger and more advanced scale. Through this network, the Old Ones spread their spawn to many places in the galaxy, but they also knew that all life was precious. Where they passed, they seeded new intelligent species and reshaped thousands of worlds to make them their own, according to their predetermined environmental and geographic criteria. It is believed by some in the Adeptus Mechanicus that even Terra felt the Old One's touch long before humanity's rise to self-awareness, though this notion is considered heretical at best by the Ecclesiarchy, as the Imperial Creed teaches that mankind was made in the image of the God Emperor before his spirit was incarnated in physical flesh millennia ago. The Old One's civilization reached its height in excess of 60 million standard years ago. The Old Ones were responsible for the creation or genetic advancement of most of the currently active intelligent species of the galaxy, including the Aeldari, the Krork, the Orcs precursors, the Slan and the Jokaero, though it is unknown if they played any direct role in the evolution of humanity. The Necrontyr and the Wars of Secession, the humanoid species that would become the Necrons, began their existence under a fearsome, scoring star in the far reaches of the galaxy known as the Halo Stars region, billions of standard years before humanity evolved on Terra. Assailed at every moment by solar winds and intense radiation storms, the flesh and blood species known as the Necrontyr became a morbid people whose precarious lifespans were riven by constant loss. What little information the Imperium of Man has recovered on the Necrontyr tells that their lives were short and uncertain, their bodies blighted and consumed at an early age by the terrible cancers and other illnesses linked to the high levels of ionizing radiation given off by their sun. Necrontyr cities were built in anticipation of their inhabitants' early demise, as the living were only brief residents scratching their daily livelihoods in the shadow of the vast sepulchres and tombs of their ancestors. Likewise, their ruling dynasties were founded on the anticipation of an early death, and the living were thought of as no more than temporary residents hurrying through the more permanent and lasting structures raised to honor the dead. On the Necrontyr homeworld, the greatest monuments were always built for the dead, never the living. Driven by necessity, the Necrontyr escaped their crucible prison and struck out for the stars, hopeful of carving out an empire in which they could realize their species' freedom from the lethal energies of their birth star. Using stasis crypts and slow-moving antimatter-powered torch ships that were clad in the living metal, known as necrodermis, to resist the millennia-long journeys through the void, the Necrontyr began to colonize distant worlds. Little by little, the Necrontyr dynasty spread ever further, until much of the ancient galaxy answered to their rule. From the earliest days, the rulers of individual Necrontyr dynasties were themselves governed by the Triarch, a council composed of 3 Necron dynasty monarchs known as Pharaons. The head of the Triarch was known as the Silent King, for he addressed his subjects only through the other 2 Pharaons who ruled alongside him. Nominally a hereditary position, the uncertain lifespans of the Necrontyr ensured that the title of Silent King nonetheless passed from one royal dynasty to another many times. The final days of the Necrontyr Empire occurred in the reign of Sarek, the last of the Silent Kings. Sometime during their slow interstellar expansion, the Necrontyr encountered an ancient species, far older than any other in existence in the known galaxy. These beings were the Old Ones, and they were absolute masters of forms of energy the Necrontyr could not even conceive of, yet alone wield. The Old Ones had long ago conquered the secrets of immortality, yet they refused to share the gift of eternal life with the Necrontyr, who yet bore the genetic curse of the bitter star they had been born under. The colonization of much of the galaxy by the reptilian mystics had been immeasurably swifter and more expansive than that of the Necrontyr because of their warp gates and mastery of the immaterial. That, and the Old Ones' incredibly long, if not downright immortal lifespans, kindled a burning, jealous rage in the Necrontyr, which ate at their culture spiritually as much as physical cancers consumed their bodies. The Necrontyr were astonished to learn that another intelligent species enjoyed such long lives, while their own were cut so brutally short. But as time wore on, further strife came to the Necrontyr. Each dynasty sought to claim its own destiny, and soon the great houses were engaged in all-out conflicts, known as the Wars of Secession. Had circumstances remained as they were for but a generation more, it is possible that the Necrontyr would have wiped themselves out as so many species had before them and shall do in the future. As their territory grew ever wider and more diverse, the unity that had made them strong was eroded, and bitter wars were waged as entire realms fought to win independence. Ultimately, the Triac realized that the only hope of unity for their people lay in conflict with an external enemy, but there were few who could prove a credible threat to the technologically advanced Necrontyr. Only the Old Ones were a prospective foe, powerful enough to bind the feuding Necrontyr dynasties to a common cause. Such a war was simplicity itself to justify, for the Necrontyr had ever rankled at the Old Ones' refusal to share the secrets of eternal life. So it was that Sarek, the last of the Silent Kings, in a typically bitter act of jealousy and resentment for the Necrontyr race, declared war on the Old Ones. At the same time, he offered amnesty to any secessionist Necrontyr dynasties who willingly returned to the fold of the Triarch. Thus, lured by the spoils of victory and the promise of immortality, the separatist Necrontyr realms abandoned their wars of secession, and what was later known as the War in Heaven began. A conflict unlike any fought before erupted across the stars. Yet while the Silent King and the Triarch had succeeded in uniting their hateful people, it was a war the Necrontyr could not win, not on their own. The War in Heaven. The terrible wars between the Old Ones and the Necrontyr that followed, known later in Aeldari myth as the War in Heaven, would fill a library in their own right, but the Necrontyr could never win. Their superior technology was consistently outmaneuvered by the Old Ones thanks to their mastery of the webway portals and warp gates. The Necrontyr were pushed back until they were little more than an irritation to the Old Ones' dominance of the galaxy, a quiescent threat clinging to their irradiated world among the halo stars, exiled and forgotten. The Necrontyr's fury was cooled by their long millennia of imprisonment on their homeworld, slowly transforming into an utter hatred towards all other forms of intelligent life, and an implacable determination to avenge themselves upon their seemingly invincible enemies. But in the face of defeat, the always fragile unity of the Necrontyr began to fracture once more. No longer did the prospect of a common enemy have any hold over the disparate dynasties. Scores of generations had now lived and died in the service of an unwinnable war, and many Necrontyr dynasties would have gladly sued for peace with the Old Ones if the ruling Triarch had permitted it. Thus began the second iteration of the Wars of Secession, more widespread and ruinous than any that had come before. So fractured had the Necrontyr dynasties become by then that, had the Old Ones been so inclined, they could have wiped out their foes with ease. Faced with the total collapse of them, the Triarch searched desperately for a means of restoring order. In this, their prayers were answered, though the price for their species would be incalculably high. It was during the reign of the Silent King Sarek that the godlike energy beings known as the Citan first blighted the Necrontyr. It is impossible to say for certain how the Necrontyr first made contact with the Citan, though many misleading, contradictory and one-sided accounts of these events exist. The dusty archives of the tomb world of Solemnace claim it was but an accident, a chance discovery made by a stellar probe during the investigation of a dying star. The Book of Mournful Night, held under close guard in the Aeldari Black Library's innermost sanctum, tells rather that the raw hatred that the Necrontyr held as a species for the Old Ones sang out across space, acting as a beacon that the Citan could not ignore. Another account claims that from the earliest days of their civilization, Necrontyr scientists had been deeply engaged in stellar studies to try to understand and protect themselves from their own sun's baleful energies. After long bitter centuries of searching for some power to unleash upon the Old Ones, the Necrontyr researchers used stellar probes to discover unusual electrodynamic anomalies in the oldest dying stars of the galaxy. In the complex skeins of the energetic plasma of these suns, the Necrontyr found an intelligence that was more ancient than that of any of the corporeal species in creation, including the Old Ones, entities of pure energy that had spawned during the birth of the stars eons before. These entities had little conception of what the rest of the universe entailed when the Necrontyr first found them, feeding upon the solar flares and magnetic storms of these bloated red giants. Here was the weapon the Necrontyr had long sought to bring about the downfall of the Old Ones, beings they believed were the progeny of the death god they had long worshipped. Howsoever first contact occurred, the shadow of the Titan fell over the oldest Necrontyr dynasties first. The power of these star-born creatures was incredible. The raw energy of the stars made animate, and the Necrontyr called them the Citan or star gods in their own tongue. The Citan were dispersed across areas larger than whole planets. Their consciousness is too vast for humanoids to comprehend. How the Necrontyr ever managed to communicate with them is unknown to the Adeptus Mechanicus. Understanding that such diffuse minds could never perceive the material universe without manifesting themselves in a material form, some Necrontyr actively sought the Citan's favor and oversaw the forging of physical shells for the Citan to occupy, cast from the living metal called necrodermis that they had once used for their colony torch ships. Fragmentary Eldari legends tell of translucent streamers of electromagnetic force shifting across space as the star vampires coiled into their new bodies. In the physical realm, across an incorporeal bridge of starlight. Thus clad, the Citan took the physical shapes of the Necrontyr's half-forgotten gods, hiding their own true desires beneath cloaks of obsequious subservience. Incomprehensible forces were compressed into the living metal of the necrodermis bodies, which the Necrontyr had forged as the full power of the Citan at last found form. As the Citan focused their consciousnesses and became ever more aware of their new mode of existence, they came to appreciate the pleasures available to beings of matter and the other realities of corporeal life. The deliciously focused trickles of electromagnetic energy given off by the physical bodies of the Necrontyr all about them awakened a new hunger in the Citan, very unlike the one they had once sated, using the nourishing but essentially tasteless energies of the stars. So it was that one of the Citan came before the silent King Zarek, acting as forerunner to the coming of his brothers. Amongst his own kind, this Citan was known as Mepheteran, the Deceiver, for he was willfully treacherous. Yet the Silent King did not know this Citan's true nature, and instead granted the creature an audience. The Deceiver spoke of a war, fought long before the birth of the Necrontyr, between the Citan and the Old Ones. It was a war, he said, that the Citan had lost. In the aftermath, and fearing the vengeance of the Old Ones, he and his brothers had hidden themselves away, hoping one day to find allies with whom they could finally bring the Old Ones to account. In return for this aid, the Deceiver assured, he and his brothers would deliver everything that the Necrontyr craved. Unity could be theirs once again, and the immortality that they had sought for so long would finally be within their grasp. No price would there be for these great gifts, the Deceiver insisted, for they were but boons to be bestowed upon valued allies. Thus did the Deceiver speak, and who can say how much of his tale was truth? It is doubtful whether even the Deceiver knew, for trickery had become so much a part of his existence that even the Citan could no longer divine its root. Yet his words held sway over Zarek, who, like his ancestors before him, despaired of the divisions that were once again tearing his people apart. For long solar months, he debated the matter with the other two pharaohs of the Triarch and the nobles of his royal court. Through it all, the only dissenting voice was that of Orican, the court astrologer of the Triarch, who foretold that the alliance between the Necrontyr and the Citan would bring about a renaissance of glory, would destroy forever the soul of the Necrontyr people. Yet desire and ambition swiftly overrode caution, and Orican's prophecy was dismissed. A Necrontyr, year after the Deceiver had presented his proposition, the Triarch agreed to the alliance, and so forever doomed their species. For their part, the Necrontyr soon fell into awe of their discoveries, and the Citan moved to take control over their benefactors. The powers of the Citan manifested in the physical world were indeed almost godlike, and it was not long before the Citan were being worshipped as the star gods the Necrontyr had named them. Perhaps they had been tainted by the material universe they had become a part of, or perhaps this had always been their nature even when they were bound to the suns they fed upon. But the Citan proved to be as cruel and capricious as the stars from which they had been born. They soon reveled in the religious worship of the Necrontyr and feasted upon the electromagnetic life energies of countless mortal slaves. In conclusion of part 1, now I know you have more curiosity. After all, we've not even come close to the human era, much less the era predominantly featured in the literature and the tabletop that has inspired us all. Rest assured, dear listener, there will be more to follow. I hope that you will join me again in part 2 of this series, where we will resume our discussion, beginning with the biotransference and the rise of the Necrons. Until then, let me leave you with an excerpt from the Book of Mournful Night. When the Silent King saw what had been done, he knew at last the true nature of the Citan, and of the doom they had wrought in his name. Until next time, dear listener.